Hello, students. This is Professor Gore, and this is part two of the World War One recorded lecture. And so, in part one, we talked about the causes of World War One for Europe, and so we can summarize those with MANIA acronym: militarism, alliances, nationalism, imperialism, and assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. So, basically, the war begins on the Western Front, and then it'll start pretty quickly on the Eastern Front as well. And so, what ends up happening is the Germans invade Belgium, which is a neutral country, to try to capture Paris within 60 days or something. And they were driven back at the first Battle of the Marne River, and then they retreated into Belgium and part of France, and they dug in. Because of the nature of machine guns, it favored defensive positions as well as the artillery as well. So the British and the French and the Belgians approached the German lines and then dug in their own trenches. And so what ends up happening is on the Eastern Front, Russia finally mobilizes and they began attacking the Germans. They drove the Germans back and looked like they were about to rout the Germans, but then Germans counterattacked and drove back the Russians. And so what happens on the Eastern Front is these big, massive battles that tend to be a little more mobile than in the Western Front that was trenches and stalemated. Not that they didn't fight in trenches on the Eastern Front, they did, but the battles lines tend to be much more fluid. The Austrian-Hungarians did not do very well against the Russians. They also fought the Russians on the Eastern Front. The Russians did pretty well against the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And kind of hit or miss with the Germans. Even though the Russians had tons of men and material, they really weren't, their soldiers weren't equipped as well as they could have been or should have been. Sometimes you might have a rifle for every 1 to 4 guys or something. They also did employ women soldiers as well on the front. And so, but the Western Front is a stalemate. There was a couple of different battles that tried to dislodge each side. There was a big offensive in 1915 that failed. There was a big German offensive in 1916 known as Verdun, and it's one of the worst places to be in world history. But the German commander's strategy is for every 2 to 3 Germans that are killed, they want to kill 5 French, knowing that they had more men than the French. The British, to keep their alliance with France, were pressured to have their own offensive to basically help relieve the pressure at Verdun. And so they did this battle called the Battle of the Somme, where they thought after shelling the German lines for three solid days that there was going to be nothing left of them. And then as they walked across the open field, and the Germans came up out of their bunkers that were dug pretty well deep into the ground. And what really protected the Germans was the type of rock that they hadn't dug their bunkers in. The Germans came out and just started mowing down the British and one of the French units that fought with them. But it did relieve the pressure of Verdun. The Germans pulled out a lot of their offensive and then to reinforce at the Battle of the Somme. Then, and what ends up happening, the Germans had been sinking British and French ships as best they could. The United States declares neutrality, but their submarines began sinking a lot of vessels. Now, the German Navy did try to break through the British blockade in the North Sea, and it was the biggest naval battle in world history that takes place. It's fought to a draw, so the Germans are not successful there. Also in 1915, the Italians entered the conflict, and they fight a trench warfare in the mountains against Austria-Hungary, and that was kind of fought back and forth. The Austrian-Hungarians routed the Serbians, and then the Ottoman Empire also entered in 1915 along with Bulgaria, along the Central Powers. The Ottoman Empire had tried to regain some territory they had lost to Russia in the 1800s. They don't do very well against the Russians at all. In fact, at one point when they're retreating, they began killing, massacring, committing ethnic genocide against the Armenian Christian population that they thought were supporting the Russians. So anyway, just to kind of help you understand this. Germany really was starting to get desperate by 1917, but what ends up happening in 1917 is that the Russians end up having a Bolshevik revolution. I'll cover that a little bit more in detail in just a minute, but that's going to lead to them pulling out. Once that happens, Germany is going to have a free arm to now have two arms to fight against the British, the French, and the Belgians on the Western Front. So they transferred millions of troops from the Eastern Front to the Western Front and launched an offensive in 1917. And so, and particularly into 1918 as well. And they were driving back the Allies and were within a few miles of Paris. But they were turned back at a couple of key battles. One of them was the second Battle of the Marne River. And what ends up happening because of this offensive, the Germans think, oh man, we got the British and the French whipped. It doesn't matter if the United States threatens us, with us sinking their merchant vessels who are trading with the British and the French. We will continue unrestricted submarine warfare. We'll be able to knock out the British and French before the Americans ever get over here, and then we'll be able to fight them. And so that's the mentality and what was happening on the battlefield that led to Germany having that position. So the Western Front was a stalemate after the first Battle of the Marne River through the German offensive in 1917 and 1918. Of course, Panama Canal, the United States had built, was a very key thing. A lot of Americans did not want to intervene in the European War when it broke out. So this political cartoon on the front side of Uncle Sam has got a sign that says "Peace on Earth" or whatever, and on the backside, "War ammunition for sale, orders filled promptly." So, United States factories made quite a bit of money selling weapons and materials for the war effort. Now, the United States would have sold to Germany and Austria-Hungary and along with Britain and France, but because of the British naval blockade, they really couldn't. And so they traded with the British and the French. Now, Wilson's going to claim neutrality. And you'll see right here from this chart, I think it really illustrates things economically. So before World War I, our trade with Europe was, decent. But you see our trade after 1914 with Britain skyrocketed. France went up significantly, and all other European countries went up significantly. But then our trade with Germany, which was lower anyway than the other European countries in Great Britain, but it plummets because of the naval blockade. So it went from 70 million with Central Powers to 1.3 million. And then it went from 825 million with the Allies to 3.2 billion in the same time period. So the United States is really going to go from have a lot of debt to foreign investment banking to now the United States is going to be a creditor, and that's going to continue through the Roaring '20s until the Great Depression. So the unrestricted submarine warfare that was waged by the Germans was what was so devastating. And in 1915, they sunk a American vessel called the Sussex. And because the Sussex was sunk, Wilson sent a scathing letter to the Germans. And the Germans basically made a pledge that we're not going to sink any more American merchant Marines without warning. So usually what they would do is they would surface, tell them that they're about to sink their vessel if you're trading with the British or the French, evacuate, and then they sunk it. But a lot of the merchant Marine did not want to lose their ships or their money or their cargo or their livelihood, so they started putting guns on the top of their ships. And so when the submarines would surface, then they would shoot them, or shoot at them, I should say. And you look by 1918, 6,500 Allied ships had been sunk by the German submarine fleet. Now, one of the most infamous things that happens during World War I in terms of civilian loss of life is what happens on the Lusitania in 1915. Now, there's some causes of the United States enter in World War I. Okay, it's unrestricted submarine warfare and the Zimmermann telegram. It's not the sinking of the Lusitania. Now, the sinking of Lusitania was part of that unrestricted submarine warfare, but this happens in 1915. The United States doesn't enter the war until March of 1917. So it's not a direct cause of the United States involvement in World War I. But what had happened was it was a British commercial vessel. And the Germans had sent warning. The German ambassador had sent flyers out warning American passengers don't travel on a British or French ship because it could be sunk. Lusitania claimed that they didn't have any weapons, but history has since shown that it did contain weapons on the ship. But what ends up happening is the Germans sink it. with the torpedo right off the coast of Ireland. The reason why the death toll is not as bad as the Titanic is because they were close enough to the Irish coast. If you could get on something that could float, or you were an incredibly strong swimmer, you could make it to the Irish coast. A lot of Irish civilians built fires on the coast to keep people from getting hypothermia. Because you had that kind of effort, there wasn't as much death as the Titanic. But 128 Americans or so lost their lives on the Lusitania, and almost 1,200 civilians died total. And so this really was a kind of a public relations nightmare for the Germans. And so you can see the cover of the New York Times right after this happened. And notice that one of the Vanderbilts was on that ship. So after the sinking of Lusitania, more and more, particularly on the East Coast, were in favor of going to war with Germany. Wilson, he runs in 1916 on the campaign slogan, "He kept us out of war." But then his inauguration year for his second term, he's actually going to ask Congress for declaration of war that same month. So the Sussex Pledge, the Germans promised not to sink any more passenger ships without warning, but that doesn't mean they're still not going to sink them. And so Wilson wisely endorsed a $1 billion buildup for the Army and Navy. Teddy Roosevelt had been arguing for this since 1914 when war broke out, and been calling for the United States to go to war in 1915. And so there's where the Sussex Pledge was happened. But so early 1917, Germany sent the U.S. a message: hey, we're going to wage unrestricted submarine warfare. If you train with the British and the French, get over it. And so after 2 more American vessels are sunk and the Zimmerman telegram was uncovered, which I'll cover in just a second, Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war. And so in March of 1917, Congress overwhelmingly decides to go to war and declare war on the Central Powers. Now, primarily the United States is going to be fighting the Germans. We do send some troops to Russia to stop the Germans from capturing Russian military supplies after the Tsar was overthrown and Russia pulls out of the war. And they're going to be in the midst of their Bolshevik Revolution for several years. But the American troops are starting to send over there towards the end of 1917 and the beginning of 1918. It's really the last 6 months of the war on the Western Front that the majority of American troops get in there. In fact, there was a lot of troops that were en route to Europe when the armistice was signed. And I love this image to show World War I, because you have the old world meeting the new. You don't have a paved road. It's muddy. You have motorized trucks, okay, but you still have horse-drawn carriages. It looks like utter chaos. Okay, and I like showing students images of the trenches and so forth, and you can see the different helmets of troops. The bottom right are Germans, and the top left, some of these are British, or the ones at the top right are Australian, actually. These are German prisoners in the top right. These are Russian troops in the bottom. Notice I don't have any helmets. These are troops in the top right are at the Battle of Gallipoli, which was a disaster for the British forces that I cover more in detail in world history. Here's some more what trench warfare looked like. There's a Maxim machine gun. These are German troops in the early part of the war. You can see some grenade launchers on the front of those. And these are Australian troops at the bottom left attacking at the Battle of Gallipoli. And this is what no man's lands look like at the top right. Airplanes, tanks, and ships, and so forth. So election of 1916, Wilson is going to beat Charles Evans Hughes. He doesn't beat him by much, but it's a fairly close election, but Wilson still wins, and he runs on the campaign slogan, "He kept us out of war." But you look right here, this is the number of ships sunk between September of 1916 and April of 1917, a month after the U.S. declares war. Look how many ships are sunk. And then you look at it, May 1917 to January 1918. Wow. Okay. Plus a lot of American vessels are coming over there. Now, the other cause of the United States entry into World War I is Zimmerman telegram. What had happened was Arthur Zimmerman, the ambassador to the United States from Germany, was told to go meet with Mexico to try to create an alliance with Mexico. Now, the reason why that was a possibility is because of what had happened with the Mexican Revolution of the 1910s, and what had happened with Pancho Villa and Victoriano Carranza, and the United States sending in troops to go capture Pancho Villa. Tensions were pretty high with the Americans and the Mexican forces. And so, even though we don't go to war with Mexico, Germany says, hey, if you will attack the United States after we win in Europe, we will help you recapture New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona. And the goal was to keep the United States on this side of the Atlantic instead of going over to Europe. Anyway, but British intelligence uncovers it when the word gets out. Americans are furious about this, and it adds fuel to the fire. Now, so anyway, anti-German sentiment spread throughout the country. A lot of Americans began making German Americans take loyalty oaths to the Union or to the country. German agents also blew up an American factory, so they were preparing for the United States entry into World War I. And there was all these different civilian units that were training to prepare the United States for war. The country was fairly divided on it for a while, but by 1917, the majority of the country supported going to war. Here was the coded German telegram. That's it translated. And then Wilson says that, we're going to go to war to make the world safe for democracy. Because Wilson was an idealist, he's going to make this out to be much than just freedom on the high seas. He's going to make this out to be that the United States has a moral obligation, that the United States should defend human rights, the United States should help punish Germany. This is going to be the war to end all wars, and yada, yada, yada. So anyway, it is. He gives a riveting emotional speech, idealistic by certainly, and definitely not going to accomplish all that. But here's the principles that he said the United States should fight for: peace, ironically, war to end all wars, the world, making the world safe for democracy. That was the big slogan. Defend human rights, defend our trade, neutrality, freedom of the seas, violation of international law. This is a political cartoon against the Germans. This is that political cartoon I was referring to you about the United States kind of being two-faced there. Now, I will cover the war for the United States in part 3 of this lecture.